Hello everybody, this is the Lone Coder. Welcome back to the course where we're going to be learning React.js. In today's video, we're going to learn about the basic rules of JSX. In case you don't know what JSX is the markup language that we're going to be using to create our React components. It is a hybrid language. It stands for JavaScript XML. It's like a mix between JavaScript and HTML. So today we're going to go over the rules of JSX and I'm going to go through some examples. And then in the next videos, we're going to actually learn how to create components with JSX. So the most important thing about JSX is that it allows us to treat HTML tags and HTML elements as JavaScript expressions. And as you can see here, I messed up this slide. I accidentally included some text from one of the previous videos, so just ignore everything right here. But then over here, I gave a couple of examples of using JSX and HTML as JavaScript expressions. So you can see there's a constant variable here called heading, and inside of it, this may look weird in a JavaScript context, but we are actually storing an h1 element with the text hello world inside of that JavaScript variable. And that's because this is not regular JavaScript, this is JSX. So I'm actually going to show you an example of this. I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be a text file. I'm going to select the language as JavaScript. So if I try to do the same thing we did on that slide, I'm going to create a variable called heading. And inside of it, I'm going to try to store an h1 with the text hello world. And this actually makes no sense in a JavaScript context. So if we were to actually run this file using Node, I'm actually going to save this right now. I'm just going to leave the title as it is. I'm going to open up a terminal, and then inside of here, I'm going to run node and then untitled1.js. And you can see here it says syntax error unexpected token less than angle bracket. And as you can see here, it highlights this part right here as the first part where the syntax error came in. And so that just goes to show you that this is not valid JavaScript code. I mean, VS Code isn't actually highlighting it as an error because it knows that there's a possibility that this is a React component file. But I just wanted to show you that this is not regular JavaScript. So we can also treat this HTML JavaScript hybrid as an expression in the sense of returning it from a function, as you can see here in the second example. I just created a simple React component. It's about as simple as you can get. And there's no need to understand this entirely, but you can see it's just a plain JavaScript function that just starts with a capital letter, and it's called a component. And then we return an expression, and that expression is another h1. It's the same h1 as up here. And so you can see that we can actually return these expressions from functions just like we can with any other JavaScript expression. So now that we know this, now that we know that this is not regular JavaScript, but instead HTML that we can store as a JavaScript expression, let's go into some of the major rules of this hybrid language, this JSX. So the first major rule of JSX is that you can only have a maximum of one top-level element per expression. And so let me go ahead and show you what that means. So I'm actually going to start out with a brand new file, except with this one, when I select the language, I'm going to keep doing JavaScript, but I'm going to choose JavaScript React. And the difference is that instead of having the JS extension, it has the JSX extension. And inside of this file, I'm just going to create a couple of random JSX elements. I'm just going to start out with an h1 that says the first top level element, and then directly under that I'm going to create a paragraph tag, and you can see this is already giving an error, but I'm just going to continue. I'm going to name this second top level element. And the reason these are both top level elements is because they have no container. They are not inside of another element, and that is a big problem with JSX. You cannot have two top level elements in any expression, in any given expression such as this. They need to have one container at maximum, or just a single element. So if I delete this, you could see that this is not an error because there's only one top level element. But if I put it back in, then it highlights it red. And so in order to solve this, we need to give them a top level element. So I'm just going to create a new line above this, and I'm going to make a div. And you can see the error is still there, but I'm going to delete the closing tag and move it down here. And as you can see, all the errors went away because now there is only one top level element, and that's the div, and then below it we have two child elements. So the second major rule of JSX is that we have this special syntax called React fragments, and React fragments are nameless tags, so they look like HTML tags but without a name like div or h1. They're just blank, and they're used as wrapper elements. So to go back to this example, there are times when you want an expression that does not have a container like this. Sometimes you just want to have an h1 and then a paragraph tag or any other element. And so what you can actually do in React is get rid of the div in here and just leave this empty. And so it's not a div, it's not a section, it's really not anything. It's just a generic wrapper element that does not actually show up on the DOM. So that is just a little trick that you can do in React that will come in handy many times for you. So I just thought I should include that as a major rule of JSX. So let's go back to here. And the third major rule of JSX has to do with closing tags, because all JSX tags, every single one, must be explicitly closed. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to show you an example of this. I'm just going to create an image element, but I'm not going to close it. But as you can see, VS Code automatically closed it for me, but if I go ahead and get rid of that, this turns into an error. And as you can see, it expected a closing tag, but it didn't get one. Whereas in HTML, this would be perfectly legal. You know, we could add in our source or whatever, and this will be no problem at all in HTML, but it is in JSX. And it's the same thing with the input element. If I go ahead and do the same thing, it's going to want to automatically close it for me, but I'm going to get rid of that because in HTML, we would not do a closing tag for an input element. But these are both a problem, partly because they're both top-level elements, as I said, and partly because they don't have any closing tags. So I'm going to get rid of this input element. And so the way to close JSX elements that would normally be self-closing in HTML is just to add a slash before the ending angle bracket. And that'll get rid of that error because we need to close every single tag in JSX code. So as you can see, that error is gone. We can do the same thing with an input element. I'll just go ahead and close that, and it's no problem as long as I add in a top-level element. So I'm just going to do that real quick. I'll add a React fragment. So now that I added that, you can see there is no problems here. And so that is the third rule of JSX. The final rule of JSX has to do with styling, because styles must be added inline as JavaScript objects. I mean, theoretically, you could do things like, create a div element with a class name with something like container written inside. And you could have a separate CSS file, which is actually what happens with Create React App and the template that it generates. We have an app.css file, but that is not the recommended way to add styles to JSX. So what we would actually do is just get rid of this class name and add an inline style element. And inside of here, we're going to want to embed a JavaScript object. And this may sound odd, but React will read the JavaScript object and convert it to CSS styles. So we're going to embed a JavaScript expression, and we'll go more into this in just a minute here. And then we're going to add another layer of curly braces. And inside of here, we can make our styles such as color. We can set that to something like blue. And you'll notice that this is a JavaScript object. This is not using CSS syntax. So if we were to do something like background color, the difference is that in CSS, between background and color, you would use a dash. But since this is JavaScript, we're going to camel case it. So it would be background, capital C, color. And same with the blue here. You can see that it's surrounded by quotation marks, which is not legal CSS. But since this is a JavaScript object and not CSS, that's how it works. So those are all the major rules of JSX. You'll get tons of practice with all of them as we get further on in the course. But the next thing I want to go into is embedding JavaScript expressions in JSX. We saw this in the style example where we used curly braces to embed the styles into the div element. And this is a huge part of JSX and one of the things that makes React so easy to use. So in this first example with variables, and keep in mind this is not an HTML file, this is a JavaScript file or a JSX file, we have a variable called name. And that contains the string Slim Shady. And down here we have an h1 where we embed that variable with curly braces into it. So this will be a heading with Slim Shady inside. And I had actually intended to add at the beginning of this h1, my name is, and then insert the name, but I forgot. So if that joke was lost on you, then just forget about it. That was my mistake. So let's go on to the next example. And this one is with an expression. Here we have a paragraph tag where we say 1 + 1 equals, and then with curly braces, we embed a JavaScript expression, and that expression is 1 + 1, which will evaluate to 2. So this will really say, when it's rendered, 1 + 1 equals 2. And those curly braces will not be visible at all. And the final and the most interesting example is with logic. So here we have a products variable which contains an array, and then we're using the map method on that array. And for each product in that array, we can assume they're strings or objects. We return an h2, and embedded inside of that is the product name. So in this case, each product is a JavaScript object that has a name property, and we're embedding it in there. So this is 2 layers of embedding. We have this top layer of curly braces, which we use to actually embed the products array and use the map method. And then for each product, we return a JSX expression that has a JavaScript variable embedded inside of it. And that is one of the most powerful things you can do with React, because that means if you have a long array of products, you can use the single line to generate markup for all of them, whether it's 100 or 1,000 of them. Again, we'll get plenty of practice with this later on in the course. So for the second example, we have a Boolean variable called isLoggedIn and it's set to false. So obviously we're going to be using this variable to keep track of whether the current user is logged in or not. And then down here, we embed a JavaScript expression, and here we are using another Boolean expression, and we're using short circuit evaluation to determine whether the user is logged in or not. So you can read this as, if the user is logged in, return this h1 with the text welcome inside of it. And if they're not logged in, nothing will show up unless we add that into the JSX. So as it stands, with isLoggedIn being false, you will not see this h1 on the web page because isLoggedIn is false, and so this whole expression will evaluate to nothing. And so that goes to show you the kind of things you can do with JSX that you just can't do with vanilla JavaScript. And this is one of the things that makes React such a joy to use and to develop applications with. And if you don't understand everything that I said in this video, don't worry about it. Like I said, we'll be getting plenty of practice, and I will be returning to these rules over and over again throughout the course as we learn how to create components and whatnot. So just hang in there. I assure you everything will make sense eventually, and I guarantee you'll have a great time developing apps with React. So in the next video, we're going to learn how to create functional and class-based components. We're going to start with functional components, and then next time we're going to go into class-based components. That's just because functional components are way more popular, and you'll see them way more often than class-based components, but it's still important to learn about class-based components because you may have to edit someone else's code that uses them. So of course, I hope you're understanding everything that I'm saying, but if you're not, no worries, we're going to go through all in detail. So hang in for the next video, and we'll actually start building our first React app, making changes to the template created by Create React App, and you'll get some hands-on experience actually developing a full React application. So with that said, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.